Anthony, good morning. How are you?
I'm doing well. Chris, we haven't had a Seinfeld reference in several episodes, and I'm feeling a little bit anxious about it.
And you haven't dropped its professionalism in quite a bit either.
Oh yeah, it's your professionalism that I respect.
Yeah, so
Thank God. I feel better about life.
I feel a little bit better, yeah.
Anthony, imagine a company that had the perfect plan to revolutionize the smartphone. Market that failed miserably when it came to actually making it happen. Remember the BlackBerry? I fucking loved BlackBerries. I could still probably type faster on a BlackBerry than I can on my.
So you were the guy.
I loved them. So they had the strategy to dominate, but they couldn't execute. Today, we're talking about strategy and execution and the delta. So, Anthony, what's understanding the difference between strategy and execution? Because clearly they're the same thing, right? If I come up with a brilliant strategy, it's just going to automatically happen. It's going to be great, right? That's really, because as strategists, that's what I believe.
Yeah, but so I think it's important to just first talk about what is strategy and execute. Like it's
strategizing. It's the same thing. It's strategizing.
It's strategery.
Strategery.
You hear also Mr. Wonderful always says it's always about execution, right? On Shark Tank. And it's like, well, what does that mean? What is the difference between strategy and execution? I think the difference is really simple. Strategy is the plan, and execution is the doing of that plan. And how many companies operate without a plan and just execute, operate without a strategy? They're just doing it. They're doing the same thing every day, or just kind of plugging away and not looking up. And how many companies exclusively are like locked in strategy? I think that is our government right now. Like all we're doing is strategery. Come on, Chris. I got to give you a political. That wasn't even political. That wasn't even political. Don't get upset. That was
I'm going to make you start doing push-ups every time you do some sort of snide political reference. And by the end of an episode, you're just going to be ripped. You're going to have huge shoulders and back. It's going to be great.
But I mean, I guess it's the analogy that, there's a lot of, when companies get really big, they spend all of these times in the boardroom talking about strategy. And it's really interesting. There's a study at The Economist. This is only 10% of organizations successfully execute their strategy. So essentially it's this balance between, it's obviously strategy is planning, executing is doing. How do you balance between what is too much strategery and not enough execution, and then flip that? Like, how do you balance those two things, Chris?
I think you've now hit this problem perfectly, which is there is such thing as too much strategy. There's intricate, difficult, wild plans about how you're going to conquer the world 30 years from now, which is great. It's great that you're thinking that far ahead. And then there is too much execution without any strategy, without any real plan, just a bunch of people that are keeping their head down. They have no idea what they're doing. So I think that is kind of the frame of the problem, which is how do you develop a real and actionable strategy? Because to your point, I'm reading the same statistics. It says that 67% of well-formulated strategies fail due to poor execution. Harvard Business Review. IBM says 90% of organizations fail to execute their strategy fully. So this is an epidemic. This is not just a founder problem. This is a business problem in the world. And so clearly we have something that's amiss between these great plans and the execution of it. And then I think to throw the other part in here, and this is that piece where we at least have to get it on the table. We always say no plan survives contact with the enemy, right? Is that okay? Is it okay, the fact that we have this strategy and we don't really, get to the place? So I think we framed the problem well. One more question is that misalignment. What do you think about, like, kind of, we think that maybe misalignment between strategy and execution might be the thing that really sinks the ship. Does that resonate with you, or is that?
It really does. And actually, Chris, we have probably 4 podcast episode topics already outlined on how to actually translate strategy into execution. Hark doesn't know this, but I've got him mapped out as a guest to talk about entrepreneurial operating systems.
I love it. I think we just call him just randomly.
We're just gonna call him. By the way, you're now on the.
You're
podcast,
now, you're live on the air, Hark.
So we're gonna talk about EOS. We're gonna talk about the Musk algorithm. We're gonna talk about all kinds of ways to operationalize strategy. And I think there is a misalignment, because obviously there's a misalignment because there's a really good business for that's what consultants do. They're like, all right, here's how you take your strategy and execute it, right? And so there's a huge gaping hole in how organizations, big and small, actually execute on strategy. Once you define a strategy, oftentimes it sits in a drawer, and it never gets implemented. So we will be talking about this at length.
Just one more thing to add, Anthony.
How do you sync those two things up?
Just for you is that, so we're talking about this like this is a business problem, but for founders and particularly early stage companies, how do we think about this problem? Because it exists for startups and early stage companies too.
Yeah. So this is I think this is probably one of my weak points, actually, Chris, is I'm very tactile when I lead, and I feel the strategy. I don't always do a great job of writing it down and communicating it unless I'm forced to. So I kind of have to force myself to do that. And I generally run really early stage companies that your strategy is changing literally weekly. Your vision's the same, but your strategy and how you execute on that strategy is changing all the time, because you're learning, and you're like, the last thing you want to do is learn something and recognize something in the market because you're in it, right? You're in theater. To further your military your analogy, you're in theater, and if you don't change tactics based on what's happening in the organization, and you don't change your strategy, you'll die. Like the circumstances of the market will consume you because you haven't recognized the differences. Conventional wisdom says that it isn't having a great strategy. Isn't a great strategy enough? Like, so right. If you have a great strategy, can you guarantee success?
I want to believe that to be true. I know it's not, but I love drawing shit on whiteboards, and that's usually where a business plan is born, right? It's on a whiteboard. They're like, great, we have it all figured out. Let's go to lunch, everybody.
Here we go.
Yeah, we'll take the rest of the afternoon off because we have the right strategy to do it. Yeah, I love to believe that to be true, but I know it's not, right? So what is your take on building a strategy? How do you think about strategy? And then, I guess we'll start there, and then we could talk about, what does that actually look like when it comes to execution?
My favorite quote on this, famous Thomas Edison quote: "Vision without execution is just hallucination." So
it's a great quote.
So if you're but when I think about strategy, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. That's Dwight D. Eisenhower. Plans are worthless, planning is everything. So I think about strategy in in that standpoint. Like the act of planning. The plan isn't, you're not going to follow the plan, but the act of creating the plan helps you think about what to do next. And if you can do that in a team, I think that's I can wrap it up there. That's it. That the act of creating the strategy is the most important part. Do you agree? No, you don't like it. Okay, good.
No, like I think you're right in one sense, which is what you're talking about is the forest and the trees, which is if you're in the business, and every early stage founder is in the business, they're doing something.
Mm-hmm.
You're not sitting in your office coming up with strategy. You're not the CEO of a Fortune 50 company. You're typically delivering the service or building the product or selling. And like we've talked about this before, it's your job to get out there and talk to people. And so when you're doing that, it is very difficult to see strategy. It's very difficult to see the direction that you're heading. So as opposed to the forest and the tree analogy, I like the ship analogy, which is every once in a while, like you've got the ship pointed in the right direction, and then you can go below deck and you can mess with the engine and you can, go to the galley. You can do all this stuff that needs to be done. But occasionally you have to go back up to the bridge and see where the boat's going. Are we going that same direction? And having a dedicated time to do that every single month, I think is critically important. But what you're saying is the act like of just walking up to the bridge is enough. I don't think so. I think you got to look around. And I think you have to look at, well, it looks like there's a storm over there. It looks like, oh, if we keep going this direction, we're going to hit land. You have to be able to then say, okay, well, we've been heading this way. We actually need to start heading this way because this looks terrible, or what we've been doing isn't working. How many times have we seen that in startups, Anthony? Like where people are like, we got to keep going. We got to keep going. We got to keep going. It's like, why?
You're
failing.
You're pushing a rock uphill, but you don't know how big the hill is. And
right. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
And the myth of, you just got to persevere. And so, all right. So when you think about planning, how do you create a strategy and a plan? Like I do it on whiteboards. How do you do it?
You're asking me a question where I've already identified a weak point, right?
So you just do it in your head, which is okay. I mean,
I do it in my head, and what I've gotten to is I'll print things. So I go back to EOS, and the reason why I'm pausing is like EOS is just a great framework.
Yeah.
I kind of follow the EOS framework, and I don't want to get too detailed in it, but essentially, what's interesting about it is you can look at strategy. There's daily strategy, weekly, monthly, quarterly, yearly, right? And sometimes 5-year. And I like that compartmentalization of it. So I think about strategy like, what am I going to accomplish today, this week, this month, this quarter, this year? I love thinking about things like that. And so, and usually I will just have it in my head. But if there's a team involved, right? Once you start getting a team involved, and this really comes down to, this is kind of a segue into, Chris, the question I have for you. And it's like, how do founders think about it at different stages of the company? So, I think about it like a lot of it is in my head when it's early stage, and a lot of it gets put out once you start growing and becoming a team. So can you dive into that a little bit more, and how do you think about it in different stages?
I mean, I think it's really, this is awesome because I love this shit more than anything. Like I love sitting down and figuring out strategies and directions and whys and alignment and all that sort of stuff. And so early on, when you're thinking about a strategy, it might just be you. The thing that I always really stress is that a strategy is a hypothesis, particularly early on. It's just a hypothesis. All you're saying is, I think this is true. I just, if this is true, then this will be the result, right? If hungry people in downtown Denver that like breakfast burritos and see my sign for breakfast burritos, they will buy breakfast burritos. It's just a hypothesis. And that becomes your strategy and execution plan is just based around a hypothesis. So it's just an early series of escalating tests that are all revolving around learning more about a central theory. And so I'm a little bit more on your side of the fence here, Anthony. Early stage, you can write it down. I think writing down your hypothesis is a good idea. But writing down a full-fledged business plan or just an idea like, hey, I think if this is true, then this I think will be true as well. And I think if this is true, I think I can get product market fit and I think I can get alignment, et cetera. And so I think that that's probably sufficient for a strategy early on. And then your execution of that strategy is building a testable plan that you can go out and test and learn something. Does that seem true to you?
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe we can bring this more tactical or tactile and talk about how to founder, right? So let's talk about what the difference is between strategy and execution for this podcast. So what's our strategy and what's our execution, and how do you and I just talk about how you and I work through those?
Yeah, well, and I think, even going one layer up is that, and we've discussed this before, the vision has not changed. Right? We're here to give practical advice to founders because there is no playbook. There is no place where people can go and get the real dirty, real advice, not that highfalutin Harvard Business Review advice, like just the real dirty stuff. So,
It's your professionalism that I respect.
Thank God. No, we just need.
I got it. We're good.
We just need a couple of Seinfeld things, and we'll be back on track.
I got that for later.
The piece there. See, now I'm totally distracted. It's the professionalism. All right. No. So for us with how to founder, the vision has not changed, right?
Yeah.
The strategy is adjusted a little bit over the time. How do we do the podcast? Do we do a video podcast? What do we even do a podcast? Do we just sit down and write? Do we just record each other talking? All of those are strategic shifts. And since we're so early, they all just represent a hypothesis. It's like, well, what if we try to go at 8:00? We started doing it at 7 a.m., which was terrible because I was
those are tactics. Those are tactics.
I don't think so, because I think that the strategy there is that how can we best fulfill the vision? And so what the overall strategy is like, hey, we're going to do this podcast. Now, you're right. We probably haven't done the major shift of strategy, which difference would be like, okay, we're not actually doing a podcast. We're doing public speaking or something.
I'm going to ask you I'm going to dig a little bit deeper here and ask you a little bit deeper question. So the vision of How to Founder is to help founders, right? We want to help founders, and we believe founders are the driving force behind economic prosperity, and we want to help equip them for the journey. The strategy behind that, the strategy that we started with is we want to write the definitive guide for founders, a reference manual, like a dictionary for founders that they can sit on their desk and they can flip to and say, I'm having a problem with strategy. And they flip to this chapter of this podcast, talking about going really meta, and I can read about it, right? But the tactic, the execution to that strategy is we're going to record that as podcasts and then use the transcripts of the podcast to write the chapter.
I mean, you just gave away our secret sauce right there, which is,
Yeah, I don't know if it was ever a secret, but you're right. It is certainly sauce, but it's not secret.
I love. We got some sauce.
Close. It got a
We're
little
a little bit. We're kind of saucy, Anthony. I agree. That's saucy.
But I mean, am I thinking about the difference between strategy and execution correctly, or not? They're kind of blending together, where strategy kind of blends into execution.
But I think that's
the way to think about it.
You're perfectly outlining the problem of early stage companies. Is that when you have an early stage hypothesis, it's just a hypothesis, and that is a strategy and a tactics. They're all bundled in one. You just go do the thing, and then after a while, you go, okay, wait, is this right? And you have to sit down and say, okay, based on our vision here, based on helping founders out, is doing a podcast, recording it, and making, the transcripts and then building it into a book, is that still the right angle? Is that the best impact? Is that the best thing we can do to fulfill this vision? As we grow, which I'm sure, there's like 12 people that might listen to this one, Anthony, maybe 14, I don't know. But like, as we get to like 15 people per episode, which is, it's pretty successful. That's when you do.
It feels like you're minimizing the folks that are actually watching.
No, I mean, I love them. Like, are you kidding? This is like, if with somebody actually listening to us, it's like makes it worthwhile versus, us just talking to each other, which we do all the time anyway. So it's, seems fairly useless to be recording it if nobody else watches it. But I think that next stage, which is the growth stage, is really where you start to separate the idea of strategy and tactics. And so you've got a little bit of traction. You've got that product market fit, right? I think that's the piece. And that's really where it starts to become really critical to have those two disciplines going. Does that resonate?
Yeah, it does. It just goes back to the fact that it's why we did all that work up front and talked about vision, and that vision being kind of the foundational piece. If you change your vision, maybe you need to change the entire, like the company, right? So vision is really kind of the foundational piece. Strategy are the things, is the plans that you do to execute on the vision and mission. And then the execution is
doing those things.
Is doing those things and checking in and measuring. More importantly, execution, the final output of execution is measurement of the results, which then feeds back into your next conversation about strategy.
Okay, so here's a provocative question. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Should tactical execution change the vision? This is real. We see this shit all the time. Somebody comes to us, early stage founder, and goes, "Oh, I want to change the world by doing this." And then they get in the weeds and they start doing it. And they're like, "Oh, actually, I think I can make money over here." And so they change the entire thing that they're doing. Shit, I did that early on in my career.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of companies that have failed to do that are now business case examples of what not to do in business, right? So
it's true.
The short answer to that is hell yes, it has to. Otherwise, you're gonna die. Especially now that the pace of innovation and new business models is like an incredible pace, faster. The pace of innovation in our economy now is faster than any time ever in human history. Like, and I'm not being hyperbolic or overstating that.
No,
that is absolutely true.
It's been speeding up over the last 100 years, and I think it'll continue to speed up, which
Yeah,
is also
it's
the reason why
exponentially getting faster and faster. So if
it's the greatest time in the world to be a founder. Like, this is amazing. There's opportunity everywhere you fucking turn. Like, if you have just half a brain and look or pay attention, what an amazing time to be a founder. It's incredible.
It's also scary because it's so easy to innovate right now. It's so easy to craft a new business given the tools that are available for solopreneurs. So and then you have OpenAI that comes out with the next version of their thing, and it's like how many AI companies they put out of business just recently when they came out with their new this year they came out with creating your own GPTs. They just put a whole bunch of folks out of business.
Oh, 100%. But it's also we're literally building a business off of that concept right now. Like it is. I mean, that is the most exciting thing. It's incredible.
It's very cool. So to answer your question, we're kind of dancing around it. If you aren't changing your strategy constantly, you will die. Which means that it's a loop, right? Strategy doesn't feed execution, and it just continues to go that way. Strategy feeds execution outputs results gives you data feeds strategy, and it just is the continuous cycle.
But the original question was not about strategy; it was about vision. Like we see this all the time, where people go, "Oh, my vision is to do this thing, is to go help founders."
Then your vision's wrong.
I agree. Yeah. I agree, which is oftentimes what people do with their vision is they paint themselves into a corner. And if you keep a broad vision that says, I want to solve this problem, I want to help this group of people, there's so many different ways you can get there. And then pivoting strategy is not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
I've completely lost where we are in the thing. So we've talked about growth stage companies.
We're supposed to talk about the next is like the contrarian perspective.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. Yeah. So this is you.
Well, we've been bouncing around it. The reason why you're a little lost is like we've been bouncing around the contrarian vision throughout this. Like we've asked this question: is too much focus on execution without solid strategy lead you astray? We've already answered that. Acting without a clear plan can waste resources. Do you find that to be true? Absolutely. I think we've talked about that. What I would like you to talk about is this balance between short-term and long-term goals. And you know, if you always are focusing on these short-term gains, then you might be going down the eventual wrong path. We see companies do this all the time where they build a bunch of features into their product because of their current customers asking them to do it. And then they lose sight of the fact that they're actually going after these bigger customers that aren't going to want these features. So talk a little bit about that. Talk about these short-term versus long-term goals and how you balance those.
I'll start by just telling you a quick story because it's just so profoundly fucking stupid. I can't believe that I heard this come out of the mouth of a relatively savvy investor, angel investor, kind of leader type person. He said, the first question I ask founders is, what's your exit plan? What the fuck kind of question is that? Like, I understand what he's trying to do, which is like, hey, do you have some sort of sense that there's ever going to be liquidity?
Out? That's what he's asking, right?
How am I gonna get my money out? Right. Do you have any sense that there's ever going to be liquidity in this business? Or like, you plan on running a lifestyle business, which is a fair question to ask. Mm-hmm. But asking a founder what his exit strategy is on day 4 of his company, like, I don't know, I'm going to fucking IPO. I'm going to sell to Amazon, Google. Like, who knows? You don't even know what this thing is yet. It's like saying when you have a baby that's born this day, being like, well, I'm going to definitely, he's definitely going to be driving this sort of car. So I'm going to go ahead and buy that car. Like, you don't even know. There's no idea about what this thing wants to be when it grows up. And so I think, and this is that old business planning process that we used to have to go through, which is like, what is your 30-year strategy for this company? Without ever actually putting a product in the market and understanding what the market's going to do with it. It does relate to the stage of the company that you're in. I think it's valuable to look up and say, hey, if we're able to accomplish our goals, if we're able to do what we think we can do, we think this can be a big company that's going to be in a very interesting space with a lot of other big companies that could be interested in us. Awesome. Like, the singular piece of great advice I've ever gotten on this kind of early stage stuff is don't start companies where only one vertical could buy you. So start companies in the middle.
When you start?
Yeah, no, it's like they just start in a very interesting, fruitful market that's growing with a lot of interesting stuff going on. That's a really good piece of advice.
I think you're right. What the investor's really asking is, how am I going to get my money out? Not even that. It's, do you recognize that I'm investing in you in order for me to get a return on that investment? Like, it's more like a recognition pattern. And just to kind of a short diversion, you do not have to answer that question definitively. You should have an answer to that. I think you should have an answer to that question. The answer to that question is, well, companies like this have exited in these 6 ways.
Right.
They've exited private equity. They've done a big M&O. They've done roll-ups. They've, like, whatever the answer is, you don't have to say how you're going to exit. You just need to recognize the space that you're going into. Here's the typical exits, and there's some really easy. And it just show that you've given some thought to the strategy around what you are thinking about an exit if you're raising capital. I would also say don't raise capital, but that's a whole other conversation. Like, stop doing that.
It is kind of interesting because the tranches of money that you need when you're raising capital is a perfect way for you to reset strategy and tactics. The problem is when you're bootstrapping, you don't have those natural milestones. You don't have that feedback from investors being like, dude, you're missing the point here, right? And what they want to see is if they give you money, they say, here's our strategy, here's our execution, here's what we've learned, go to the next round. In most of those cases, those are really nice breakpoints. But as a bootstrap founder, I think that the exercise and discipline becomes, can you do that same thing? Can you go through these natural breakpoints in your business and say, look, every 6 months or quarterly, or we're going to do quarterly business reviews. We're going to get together, even if it's just you and your business partner, or if it's just you and you need to sit down for an hour and turn off the devices on a whiteboard and say, here was the original strategy. I have it written down on my whiteboard or my notebook. Here's what I've learned along the way. Does this thing still hold true, or do I need to pivot? I think that that's right, but I don't know. Anthony, what do you think?
I do. And I think we've covered this really good. I do really well. I do want, before we jump into the how-tos, the list of how-tos, I do want you to dig in on one thing, and that is the organizational team building benefits of just talking and having that regular cadence of strategic thinking. Like, it's not just about creating the plan. The process of creating the plan can help solidify your team a little bit more and make you guys a little bit more cohesive and collaborative. Go talk about that a little bit.
Well, I mean, again, this is always one of those that depends. I love talking strategy and I love communicating strategy to my team, right? And then after a while, I realized that doing that every other day was a terrible idea. Because every time I come in and be like, what about this idea? Isn't this a great idea? What they heard was we were pivoting our strategy and they should go do this thing. I was like, no, man, I was just brainstorming. I was just throwing shit against the wall. I was just thinking. I think out loud. That's what I do, right? And they're like, yes, please stop doing that to me. You do that to somebody else, but stop telling your team
that's
this is what we should
exactly what I was talking about. What I was talking about is that weekly, monthly, quarterly strategy cadence and how that helps with team building.
Right. But so that's overdoing it.
Right.
What is the right cadence is continually to check in with your team and say what is obvious to you. So you've been living with this strategy every single day. You've been sitting with it. You've been thinking about it. You kind of assume your team knows that and is with you in that moment. And that's not true.
Right.
You have to sit down with your team, particularly as you get bigger, 4, 8, 12, 16, 24 people, and clearly communicate. This was our strategy coming into the quarter. Here's what we did. Here's our results. Here's what I think we've learned from this thing. What do you guys think? Do you agree or disagree with that concept? Excellent. Here's what I propose our strategy will be going forward. And by the way, this is one of those moments where you should speak up if you don't agree with the strategy, because this is what we're going to go do. Now, when you get to 50 people, you might just, limit that to managers or leaders or something like that. But it is critically important because it creates a sense of alignment. Everybody knows what they're doing. And back to the idea of execution, you have a shared set of metrics that you can review every single day, week, month, that allows everybody to see how you're doing with those tactics. Are we on the right path? Good questions. All right. So Anthony, we've talked around this to every sort of thing. So just to recap, strategy, tactics, we've been in a pretty good, we've defined them both. We've talked about over strategizing with not enough execution, over execution without enough strategy. We've talked about how that can kind of show up a little bit on early stage, middle stage of the company. So let's get to the brass tacks. What are we going to take away here? What are the lessons that we need to learn?
I'll start with this and just say that half of companies, even more than half of companies, executives in companies, more than half, depending on the statistics, it's anywhere between 50 and 75% say that they don't execute on their strategies. So that to me says there's two problems. One is that they're over strategizing, and two, they're not properly executing on those. They're not properly translating those strategies down to the organization. So I would say start small, right? And then move your way up instead of doing this big, huge, we're going to be strategic now. And that never works. So start small. And here's some how-tos. So obviously set clear goals, define what success looks like in measurable terms, and do that in a small way. Say, here's where we're going, point the team in the direction, set clear goals, and then define success. Then align your team, ensure everyone understands both the strategy and their role in the execution. Critical component of it. Break it down, divide your strategy in actionable bite-sized tasks. So it's not just the plan, it's the how that plan is going to be executed. Monitor progress, get the data, gather information, set KPIs to track against the strategic goals. You have to be flexible, adjust your strategy based on what's working in the execution. Communicate effectively by keeping the lines open to avoid misalignment, so constantly doing check-ins. And then leverage tools. We're going to be talking quite a bit about tools in future podcasts. EOS, project management tools, which nobody likes project management tools or software to manage their strategy. Like it's a total pain, but certainly have a system in place that defines your cadence. And that can be one of 1,000, Six Sigma, EOS, there's 100 of them. Find one that works for you. The reason why we like Traction so much is because it's so lightweight, and the book is like I literally have it right here. It's thin. It's a thin read. It's easy read. It's really easy to understand.
Yeah,
Sometimes
you could skip the case studies and read it in an hour.
Yeah, it can be a little bit overwhelming to implement it correctly. Again, shout out to Hark and all EOS implementers, because you can hire folks to do it. But again, leverage tools for you to be able to translate that strategy into execution. Chris, why don't you wrap it up for us?
I think it's great. I think there's one other thing I'll add, just because having spent time with Hark and Chris Martinez and other people that are in the military, there's an idea in the military called commander's intent. And the further you get up the chain, as you're a general, one of the things that they say is you can't tell them how. That is up to the individual units to do it. But it's like, hey, this is our intent. This is our goal. This is where we're going. If it's just a small group, you can get very like, hey, let's get in the weeds and figure out how we're going to do this. But as you get big, as you're a general, as your company gets bigger, you have to set a very clear intent and then kind of get the fuck out of the way. Two sides of the same coin, Anthony, strategy and execution. You have to have both. Balance that time, balancing the concept of how much time you spent there. And I think do schedule time, particularly early, to find opportunities for you to think strategically. Allocate time wisely. Execution is about the thing that brings strategy to life. It's about actually figuring out whether that strategy is any good. Turn your ideas into reality. Deep dive recommendations, Anthony, some really good ones in here. I think that we should get $1 for every Traction book we sell, because pretty much every time we're going to recommend. I think Gino Wickman owes us a few bucks. Like, there's probably $3 he owes us. Execution, the Discipline of Getting Things Done by Larry Bossidy and Ram Charan. Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rumelt. The Art of Action by Stefan Bungay. The TED Talk, Turning Strategy into Execution by Robert Kaplan. Podcast, the Strategy Execution Podcast, episode on Bridging the Gap. There's a great article, Why Strategy Execution Unraveled.
Oh, geez, here it comes.
And What to Do About It from Harvard Business Review. And Scaling Up, A Few Companies Make It and Why the Rest Don't by Vern Harnish. And of course, Traction by Gino Wickman. Anthony, first of all, I just want to say I love your sauce. And so, you got great taste in sauce, Anthony. You do. You got great taste in sauce, and
You're liking the sauce?
It's I like the sauce. So what do we got coming up next week, Anthony? We got a bunch of good guests coming up, don't we?
Yeah. So just to kind of take it back a step. So Chris and I started this essentially as two guys that together had one, like we had one real. Actually, I have a Seinfeld reference. This is kind of how we started.
Well, thank God we're going to get a Seinfeld reference.
Here we go.
But maybe the two of us working together at full capacity could do the job of one normal man.
Each of us would only have to be like a half man. That sounds about right.
That sounds about right, Anthony.
Sounds about right. Well, in order to augment that, we're gonna have a lot of great guests coming up. So, one of the tactics I had on creating spots for guests is we signed up for Podmatch. So we have a lot of amazing guests coming up. Next podcast, next week, we're going to be talking about time management with a special guest. His name is Roman Fisher. So really looking forward to that. But we have probably 30 guests in the next 2 months already lined up. So we'll be diving deep, and it won't just be Chris and I.
You're getting sick of hearing us. That's great.
It'll
Now
be
you get to
3
hear
people and two real people in the podcast. So it'll be good. Remember to follow us on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/company/howtofounder, or just go to howtofounder.com and you can follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, LinkedIn, iHeartRadio, and X. We also broadcast on X. Chris, again, great conversation. I'm looking forward to not just it being the two of us for the next couple of months. I appreciate you, man.
I don't know that I'm going to make jokes like you're pretty saucy, Anthony, when we have guests on. But yeah, I think it's going to be great.
You should do that with your microphone a lot more. That was
You are saucy though, Anthony.
that was, now that I think about it, was really creepy. All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.